Nobody else seems keen, so I'll ask another one. Regarding the lady that spoke just beforehand, she was speaking about particular aspects of the Bible that may not, that may not sit well with us today. I was thinking about particularly aspects of maybe like Leviticus 25, where and also Exodus 21, where slavery seems to be condoned by God throughout the Old Testament. So my question would be is, if God did once condone it, and today under secular moral laws in society we've deemed it outlawed, we're not allowed to have slaves anymore, are we wrong, or is that still, could we effectively go back to a theocracy and have slaves as per Leviticus 25 and Exodus 21 and be justified?
Great question. Poor options.
I feel like in many respects I'm being offered on the slaughter of sacrifice right now. It's a very, very fair question, and again, it's one that has a lot of deep kind of nuance in the way that biblical thinkers have thought about this over the centuries. Unfortunately, the Christian church has a very dark history at certain points along where you'll find over in the US, for instance, great advocates of colonial slavery at the time there that were using the Bible to defend their right to own slaves, the idea that slaves were less than human, their freedom to be able to beat slaves. All kinds of injustices have been done while claiming the name of God and then the authority of certain Old Testament texts, and so it's a very fair question and one we need to wrestle with. I think the way many Christian thinkers have thought about this over the centuries has been to try and understand the sweep of the Bible, not so much as perhaps many other sacred texts, which are disembodied, deculturated statements of God's eternal purpose for every human across the face of the planet at all times. But as God is working throughout history, we see something they call progressive revelation, the idea of helping humanity grow up in its understanding of who God is and the reality of the cultural world around them, to be able to become mature and prepared to be able to understand and carry the teachings of Jesus Christ. So for instance, Jesus would speak, and then his first followers, the apostles in the New Testament, would speak of the law as being a schoolmaster, essentially be able to help them to prepare an old covenant that Jesus has now come to offer a new covenant, something which was set up as a political reality, a theocracy in the Old Testament for the nation of Israel, then something that's meant to be something that spreads out across the many cultures and different politics of the world, how we live as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, showing what it means to follow the way of Jesus irrespective of the rest of the culture around us. Now, when it comes to the slavery question, I'll just finish the arc and then I'll love to get some feedback.
Is that like a form of dispensationalism where
dispensationalism is a technical theological word, and so we wouldn't say that there's particular ages in that sense, but it's God working within the boundaries of the nature of people and the cultures that they're a part of to come up with the best kind of solution. Now let's go back to something to deal with criminals, for instance. In the Old Testament system, they don't have penitentiaries. They don't have guards and turret towers and weapons and ways of being able to keep people, and so the kind of laws and way of dealing with justice is very different than a situation where your technology and your culture would allow different options that are available to you. So when it comes to, for instance, like slavery, the first thing I'd say is we need to distinguish deeply between our experience of colonial slavery and the kidnapping of people groups from Africa, the idea of them being less than human, the treatment and the nature of which colonial slavery happened, which is much closer in our cultural memory, something that's racially driven, than coming into the Old Testament where slavery was a way of much more indentured servitude, of working your way out of poverty, a way of integrating new populations, of all kinds of ways of being able to help set up a culture where for 6 years people would work and then they're essentially free. It would be a nanny system or a butler system, or in terms of the kind of working conditions, it's radically different than our thinking of colonial slavery and the way in which the African peoples were treated. In no place are slaves in the Bible, in terms of Israel, treated as being less than human. But you're right, there is still this deeply uncomfortable nature of them being slaves, of sometimes being speaking almost of property, of certain conditions that are there. When you trace that through into the New Testament, the vision of God's future world that's slowly coming to bear as God's revealing himself and his people are responding. In the future world, we have people of every tribe and every tongue standing as part of God's community, fully equal, man, woman, young, old, irrespective of all of those. There's no barriers or denotions of who has a greater value than anyone else. And in the sweep of that biblical story of us being broken and part of a fallen world, but we're having to create structures and systems that help make steps forward through to that final world where God will return, what we see happening in the New Testament is amazing. In Galatians, the Apostle Paul talks about there being no difference between slaves and free people. In the book of Philemon, which is a man who was a slave owner, had an escaped slave, the Apostle Paul, this escaped slave, becomes a Christian. He then sends him back to his slave owner and says, what you lost before as a slave, now I want you to receive as a brother. It's this vision of freedom of the captives, of an undoing of oppression, this biblical ethic that Jesus set up, that ultimately I think was the undoing of our concept of racial segregation, of colonial slavery. This was the fuel that fired people like William Wilberforce and the abolitionists and over in the US as well. So I think it's one way to make sense of the sweep of how we're working in progressive history.
Sure. When you're talking about the indentured servitude type of thing, that's specifically within Exodus 21, right, where they're talking about an Israelite servant becoming a slave for 6 years.
It was also the foreign slaves though as well.
But Leviticus 25:44 does clearly stipulate that it is that colonial slavery where you can get slaves from the nations around you and they become your property for life. That it's not quite indentured servitude though, is it?
So when we're dealing with Leviticus again, this is in the lead up to the idea of the Canaan account that we were talking about before, the clearing of the land. In this sort of a situation, we need to ask the question, let's say all of the men of a particular area went to war against Israel and all of the men were in this situation killed. What opportunity then do you have for anyone who's a woman or a child to be able to survive economically in the ancient world? There isn't one. They have no welfare systems, they have no ability to protect, they have nothing like that that's set up at all. It's not a perfect system, I agree with you as we would look upon it now, but in respect, it's probably the best option that they had available to them other than leaving them to die or to prostitute themselves. And so I think when we're working within the confines of the culture, there can be something that's helpful as a way to be able to make some forward steps.
We've already violated the laws here. Each person was permitted one question. You've had 5. So we've given you more grace than law. Your assumption is actually very flawed. It's not Leviticus 25 alone that talks about slavery. If you look at the Near Eastern world at that time and see what was going on with the surrounding nations, and you come up even up to the 18th and 19th centuries, Mahatma Gandhi resisted what the West was doing, and he resisted it by saying, you are not living up to your own presuppositions on what Jesus Christ taught you. If you look at slavery and sexual slavery today, and even slavery of years gone by, it was not just that the West was involved in it. So many nations, the Middle East was involved in it, and still till this very day, a lot of that goes on. I was raised in a home with servants who had no privacy of their own lives, and I watched my mother teach me how to treat a servant. If I go back to India today, the servants who worked for us all their lives would literally want to come and touch my feet, and I move them away, and they will still call me Ravi Baba, Ravi little boy. We use the word servant. They were actually like members of the family. Abraham sent Eliezer to go to look for his daughter-in-law as he was looking for a bride for Isaac. And I just leave you with this thought. Your concern is real because your moral conscience is railing against what you're reading in Leviticus and Exodus and so on. Dan was spot on. There is a process of revelation that is going on. And in that process, they see how laws alone exploited and abused people. I think if you watch how Jesus comes and explains what the law was intended to do and was unable to do, and how only the grace of Christ was able to do it, history has sustained that. Martin Luther King Jr., his sermons were some of the most powerful sermons ever preached, and he preached from the scriptures. He taught. He was talking to the American and what they were doing to their brothers. The slaves in the time there were learning their hymns and writing Negro spirituals and so on. It is a tribute. Today the black man will say it is a tribute to the person of Jesus Christ that they followed the very God that the white man was using with which to abuse them. I've heard them make that statement because they saw the disconnect between what Christ was teaching, and you never ever judge a religion by its abuse. As you're watching the law unfold and the law unable to do what it was intended to do, and you see as you come in the very person of Jesus Christ talking about things that you and I would probably have not talked about. He never once talked about the Roman yoke. Did he think it was right? No. He never ever once criticized the Caesars. Did he think it was right? He really believed that these symptomatic issues, when you solve them, are never really solutions. They are band-aids put to a broken joint. And it is only because of the imperatives of Christ that you would even be standing here believing it would be immoral to victimize a slave from any other place. Natural law doesn't tell you that. There's no natural law that tells you that. Natural law would tell you if evolutionary theory is taken into metaphysical proposition, nature is read in tooth and claw. That's exactly where naturalism takes you. Darwin mourned the fearsomeness of what would happen if we take this scientific theory and put it into moral postulates and metaphysics. That's where we would end up. So I end up with one statement for you. You could smile, but you're invoking a moral framework that naturalism doesn't give to you.
Can we talk later?
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk later when I get some time. I'd love to talk later, but here's what I say to you. If you go to Gandhi's home in India, you'll see a banner written by an atheist, Bertrand Russell. And here's what he said. It is doubtful that the Mahatma's attempt would have succeeded except that he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people. Here is the testimony of an atheist applauding the success of a pantheist because of the beliefs of a theist. It is doubtful that the Mahatma would have succeeded except he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people. That is why Mahatma Gandhi carried a New Testament with him all his life and quoted from it, "Your aspirations are noble, which are not justifiable by naturalistic assumptions. They are only justifiable in a transcendent moral framework." And that I'd be very happy to talk to you about, and we'll find some time to do it before we go. We bring this to a close, and thank you very much.